Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 113 called Byzantium's Greatest Victory. In the last episode we heard how the Emperor Constantine IV led a revival in Byzantine fortunes in the 670s for two main reasons. The first was division within the Arab Caliphate. Civil war, or the First Fitna, broke out in 656 when Ali, Muhammad's closest relative, challenged the general Muawiyah to be caliph. The conflict gave rise to the division between Shia and Sunni Islam and showed that Islam, just like the Christian Roman Empire, was vulnerable to political and religious sectarianism. The second reason was inventing Greek fire, the petrol-based incendiary that burned on water, which gave the Byzantines a technological advantage in naval warfare, similar to the effect of gunpowder on land warfare in the early modern era. Byzantine flamethrowers destroyed the Arab fleet that had been blockading Constantinople for years in the 670s and passed naval superiority back to Byzantium. Defeated by Byzantium and fearing the loss of Syria to the Mahdite rebellion, which was an uprising of Christian Levantines, the aged Caliph Muawiyah even agreed to the unthinkable. In 677 to 678, Islam ended up paying tribute to Byzantium, albeit a limited amount, when only a few years before it had been poised to seize Constantinople. And things got even worse for Islam with the outbreak of a second civil war on Muawiyah's death. The second fitna, Islam was thrown into a destructive meltdown, with two challengers to the Umayyad dynasty battling for control of this new empire. Arab resources were drained in bloody battles between the two sides. The unthinkable continued to happen. Medina was sacked in 683 when rebels took control of the holy city. Gradually, over the course of 10 years, the Umayyads reasserted their authority, but not before their leader, Abd al-Malik, had to undergo another humiliation at Byzantine hands. In 685, in order to free his troops from the Syrian frontier to fight against his rivals, he renegotiated Muawiyah's peace treaty with Byzantium, agreeing to a vast increase in the annual tribute. According to the chronicler Theophanes, from 3,000 solidi or gold coins a year to 1,000 a day, i.e. 365,000 a year, more than a 10,000% increase, far more than the Romans had ever paid Attila the Hun or the Avars. We don't know whether this figure was true and whether the full amount was really paid, but there's no question Islamic civil war was proving to be a golden opportunity for Byzantium, both literally and figuratively. The boot was now on the Byzantine foot, but the question was, for how long? When Justinian II succeeded his father, Constantine IV, things continued to go well. During the lull in Arab activity, he devoted his attention to the Balkans, which had been neglected by Heraclius and his successors. The Slavs had occupied most of the countryside south of the Danube, and land communication with Thessalonica had become impossible. Justinian II transferred troops from across the Bosphorus and campaigned in 688 and 689, clearing Thrace of Slavs and reopening the road to Thessalonica. Indeed, he wanted to turn the Slav threat into an opportunity, and in the early 690s he moved a substantial Slav population into western Anatolia. He regarded the Slavs who were converting to Christianity as a new source of manpower for the empire. In particular, he wanted to use them as soldiers in the Byzantine army, and in 691 he had the opportunity to test them against the Arabs. This occurred because Abd al-Malik finally won the second fitna and ended the Islamic civil war. The Arabs no longer needed the truce with Byzantium, and he immediately reneged on it by sending a token tribute payment in a new type of gold coin devoid of Christian crosses and bearing instead the mantra of Islam. Quote, "In the name of God, there is no God but God alone." and Muhammad is the messenger of God. It was, in effect, a declaration of war, and Justinian II was only too pleased to test out his new Slavonic army. But it was a disaster. In 692, at the Battle of Sebastopolis in Cilicia, close to modern Antalya in Turkey, the new regiment of some 20,000 Slavs defected en masse to the Arabs, and the Byzantine army was routed. History is full of reversals of fortune, and after years of Islamic meltdown and Byzantine triumph, the pendulum now swung the other way, and the next 20 years witnessed the near collapse of the Byzantine state. One main reason was internal dissension. A historian has called the period from 695 to 717 the 20 years of anarchy, in which a succession of emperors fought each other for the throne. Justinian II was overthrown and banished in 695 by a general, Leontius, who cut off his nose and slit his tongue. Leontius, in his turn, was overthrown by Apsima, who adopted the name Tiberius. But Justinian was not to be ignored and returned, minus his nose, which was covered by a golden nose guard, in 705. He was then overthrown by Bardanes in 711, who was ousted by Artemius, who changed his name to Anastasius, until in 717 he was ousted and then succeeded briefly by Theodosius, who in 718 was himself deposed by an emperor whose name would come to be revered in Byzantine history. This was Leo III, the first of the Isaurian emperors. Had the 20 years of anarchy led to the fall of Byzantium, they would no doubt have become the subject of scrutiny and lamentation, such as has happened with the 10 years that led to the sack of Rome in AD 410. But, in fact, they were the prelude to the most dramatic and unexpected victory in Byzantium's entire history. So, let's begin this extraordinary story. And we should start with the Arab conquest of Carthage and Roman North Africa. As you know, this was an important part of the Roman Empire, and although there have been several Arab incursions into it after the Arab conquest of Egypt, none of them had succeeded in taking Carthage until in 697 Abd al-Malik captured the city for the first time. Leontius, who was emperor having overthrown Justinian II, responded decisively by sending a powerful fleet which retook the city. But the Byzantines couldn't send reinforcements, and a new Arab army, said to be 40,000 strong, almost certainly an exaggeration, led by the general Hassan, marched to Carthage, where the Byzantines had no choice but to abandon the city and sail back to Constantinople. Hassan razed the city to the ground. Yet another city from the ancient world disappeared. The fall of Carthage has received little attention from historians, but it was a seismic blow to Byzantium. The empire was now a shadow of its former self, really just a collection of a few islands and ports in the Mediterranean stretching from Sicily to the Aegean, with its only meaningful landmass comprising Anatolia north of the Taurus Mountains. But this was itself subjected to repeated and devastating Arab raiding. Remove the city of Constantinople and the empire would cease to exist. And that was certainly the conclusion of the Caliph al-Walid, who succeeded al-Malik in 705. He began preparing a vast fleet and army to take Constantinople, but he died in February 715. It was his brother Suleiman al-Malik who succeeded him and continued with the plan, inspired, according to Islamic sources, by a learned man who said that the conqueror of Constantinople would have the same name as a past prophet. Suleiman was the Arabicized Solomon, and so the Caliph became convinced it was his destiny to take the city. He was also riding on a rising tide of Islamic success. The Caliphate had by now fully recovered from the disastrous divisions of the Second Fitna and was expanding in both west and east. For example, following the capture of Carthage, Arab forces had crossed the Straits of Gibraltar in 711 and defeated the Visigoths, reaching Frankish-held Gaul by 717. In the east, Arab armies reached the Indus River in 712 and advanced into the Central Asian steppelands, bringing the Caliphate to the borders of the Tang dynasty in China. Islam seemed to be on the brink of global domination, and the capture of Constantinople would be the jewel in its crown. In the spring of 716, the largest Umayyad army ever assembled crossed the Taurus Mountains and marched towards the Byzantine capital. Described by both Byzantine and Arab sources as innumerable, or at least running into hundreds of thousands, one report said just its baggage train was larger than most Byzantine armies, since it numbered 12,000 men, 6,000 camels and 6,000 donkeys. What hope did Byzantium have? To make matters worse, the empire was actually locked in a civil war between Theodosius III, who seized power from Anastasius II, and Anastasius's two generals who remained loyal to him, Conan, who later became the famous Leo III in charge of Anatolia, and Artabasdas in charge of Armenia. But cometh the hour, cometh the man, and in the next 2 years the young Conan, a native of Cilicia who spoke Arabic, would save the empire. While the Arabs were advancing, he quickly executed a bold scheme in which he asked the Arab land commander Maslama for his support against Theodosius III. Deceived by this, the Arabs didn't sack Armorium on their route to Constantinople, allowing the powerful fortress to remain in Byzantine hands. They also allowed Conan to proceed to the capital, where, with minimum bloodshed, he secured Theodosius's abdication. Conan was a dashing soldier and a man of action, and the Senate and people of Constantinople welcomed him as their saviour. He secured Artabasdas' support by giving him his daughter Anna in marriage. He also changed his name to Leo III, the first emperor of the Isaurian dynasty. But his chances of success looked slim. Not only was the Arab general Maslama advancing towards Constantinople, furious that he'd been tricked, but a huge Arab fleet reached the Dardanelles, met Maslama's army at Abydos, and ferried it across to Thrace. On the 15th of August 717, Maslama camped his army directly opposite the great Theodosian land walls, just as the Ottoman Turks would do 6 centuries later in 1453. He built 2 palisades, one facing Constantinople and the other facing west into Thrace. Why did he need the western palisade? Well, the answer was the Byzantines had an alliance with the powerful Bulgar Khaganate in Thrace. This was an important difference compared with the siege of 626, which we've covered in an earlier episode, when the Avars controlled Thrace and besieged Constantinople's land walls. We have almost no source material on the Byzantine-Bulgar alliance, but it was probably the work of Anastasius II, who'd been preparing for this siege for years. And the Bulgars would prove to be crucially important, since they harassed the Arabs throughout the siege. Quote, so that the Arabs came to fear them more than the Romans, according to one Islamic source. Indeed, Leo was helped hugely by Anastasius II's careful preparations for the siege, which included not just getting the Bulgars on side, but also storing enormous quantities of Greek fire and building ships equipped to use it. Leo used this almost immediately when the Arab fleet tried to encircle the city. Quote, he sent fire ships against them from the citadel, which turned them into blazing wrecks, some of them still burning smashed into the sea walls, while others sank in the deep, men and all, and still others, flaming furiously, went as far off course as the islands of Oxea and Plataea. End quote. Greek fire gave the Byzantines control of the sea. The Arab fleet never ventured to attack Constantinople again. Afraid of the fire ships, it cowered in the harbours around the Bosphorus and ceased to play a significant role in the siege. Indeed, Leo enticed it out by lowering the chain that sealed off the Golden Horn, and, according to Arab sources, Byzantine warships would boldly sail up to Arab vessels, throw grappling hooks onto them, and tow them away, where they and their crew would be torched with Greek fire. This naval victory meant the Byzantines could sail supplies into the city whenever they wanted and hinder the Arabs from supplying their army. The supply situation soon became critical as the siege turned from being the quick victory the Arabs had hoped for to a protracted campaign. This became especially difficult for the Arabs as the autumn of 717 gave way to an unusually cold winter over 717 and 718. Theophanes tells us, quote, the winter was very severe in Thrace, so that for 100 days snow covered the ground, end quote. Not only were the Arabs unused to cold weather, but they were unprepared for it. We can imagine them shivering in their fragile tents without proper winter clothing as the cold, icy winds swept down the Bosphorus. The next problem was the unexpected death of the Caliph Suleiman, who died in September 717. He died without achieving his dream of taking Constantinople and was succeeded by Umar II, who had none of his fanatical drive to capture the capital of Christendom. According to Islamic tradition, there's also a rather unlikely story that Leo continued to play a deceitful game with Maslama, pretending he wanted to surrender the city and be his vassal. The Islamic version of events says the duplicitous Byzantine emperor persuaded him to burn the Arab grain supply in front of the walls to persuade the Byzantine defenders the Arabs had such a vast surplus of supplies they could maintain the siege forever. This was meant to intimidate the Byzantines into surrendering the city. I doubt Maslama was stupid enough to do this, and it was probably just a good story to tell in the hot evenings in Baghdad centuries later. But whatever the truth, there's no doubt the Arabs began to starve in the first months of 718. It was essential to get supplies to them, and the new Caliph Umar, who was in two minds about the wisdom of the whole expedition, reluctantly dispatched two fleets laden with supplies, one with 400 ships from Alexandria, the other with 260 ships from Tunis. The admirals of the two fleets were well aware of the dangers of Greek fire and hugged the coast so they could retreat into a harbour at the first sign of Byzantine resistance. But one thing they hadn't bargained for was the defection of their crews. Most of the sailors and oarsmen in the Arab ships were Christians, mainly Egyptian Copts, and therefore not always keen to help their Chalcedonian compatriots. But on this occasion, according to Theophanes, many of them fled to Constantinople in small boats and told Leo of the exact location of the two supply fleets. Leo quickly sent in the dreaded fire ships. Quote, he prepared fire-carrying siphons and put them aboard warships and two storage ships and then dispatched them against the two fleets, and the enemy was sunk on the spot. End quote. This was the final blow for the Arabs. With their supplies cut, starvation set in, and with starvation came disease. To quote Theophanes again, a plague-like disease descended on them and destroyed a countless throng. End quote. On top of that, The Bulgars stepped up their attacks, killing 22,000 in one assault, according to Theophanes. On the 15th of August, the Arabs capitulated. Caliph Umar, who'd never been enthusiastic about the expedition, gave the order to abandon the siege. But they weren't out of danger yet. On the way back, the Arab fleet was wrecked by a storm. Theophanes says of the thousands of ships that had sailed to Constantinople with such high hopes, only 5 returned home. The Arab defeat at Constantinople in 717 to 718 was one of the most significant turning points in history. Just like the German defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad in the Second World War or Napoleon's retreat from Russia in 1812, seldom had an army so confident of victory been so utterly crushed. The Byzantine victory changed the course of history. Byzantium was born. For centuries, the Taurus Mountains would now mark the new frontier with Islam. It was Heraclius who'd withdrawn his troops there after the defeat at Yarmouk in 636, and he was proved right. This towering mountain range provided a natural geographical barrier to prevent the Arabs from occupying Anatolia until the 11th century, when the Turks, approaching from Armenia, invaded it after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. But in the centuries before then, behind the Taurus Mountains, there developed a confident new state, born out of the belief it had been chosen by God to preserve both the institutions of the Roman Empire and its Christian religion. The Arabs soon despaired of ever conquering it, as an early 8th century chronicler lamented, quote, "The Romans are a people of sea and rock. Whenever a generation goes, another replaces it. Alas, they are your associates until the end of time." End quote. The Roman Empire may have died, but its spirit lived on in Byzantium. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, you must be wondering if we've finally reached the last episode of this podcast. After all, it's called The Fall of the Roman Empire, and I've said the rise of Islam, in my opinion, marked the official end of the Roman Empire. Well, the good news, if you like the podcast, is no. The Roman Empire may be dead, but I want to continue into the era often called the Dark Ages. Why? Because the people of the post-Roman world of the 8th and 9th centuries can, I think, best be described as the inheritors of Rome. They lived in the shadow of the Roman Empire, often literally in the shadow of the many great Roman buildings that survived from antiquity. Of course, the Byzantines regarded themselves as the true inheritors of Rome, but they soon had a rival in the form of the Franks. In AD 800, Charlemagne would be crowned in Rome as the new emperor of the West. And even in Islam, the Roman Empire still influenced the Arabs. For example, Arab gold coins were called dinars after the Roman denarius, and Greek philosophers came to be revered in Islamic scholarship, especially Aristotle, known as the first teacher. The Dark Ages were not just an extraordinary and fascinating time, but they were also the origins of our modern world. So let's embark on that journey. But before we do, I'd like to finish the history of the fall of the Roman Empire with a short review of why and how it fell from the sack of Rome in AD 410 to the Arab victory at Yarmouk in 636. So we'll do that in 2 weeks' time on the 19th of April. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.